Hey everybody, it's Hannah from HR Images. In today's video, we'll be doing a side-by-side comparison between the Samyang 50mm f1.4 Mark II version and the new Sony 50mm f1.4 GM lens. So stay tuned. Now, Sony's released the 50mm 1.4 GM lens, and the first thing everybody started questioning was, why another 50mm? We're currently oversaturated with a lot of 50mm lenses, but the only thing was Sony was missing was the 1.4. They have a 1.2 and not a lot of people wanted the 1.2 version. So they've released the 1.4, and one question I had been asked is, how did I like the Samyang? Because I do use the Samyang 50mm 1.4 Mark II a lot, and people's asking me to do a comparison. So this comparison is going to help you decide in which lens is best suited for you. So we'll get started with the build quality. Now the Samyang is lighter than the Sony G Master lens. Samyang weighs 420 grams while the Sony weighs about 512 grams. It is, looking at a side-by-side comparison, the Sony is taller than the Samyang lens. The Samyang is a bit more compact. Front element, the filter thread, Sony uses a 67mm thread, while the Samyang uses a 72mm thread. So it is a little wider in the diameter, but it is shorter and lighter than the Sony. Price point difference is the Samyang is about 1,249 Australian dollars, while the Sony G Master Mark IV, f1.4, do apologize, is about $2,488. So you are doubling the price in terms of the Sony and the Samyang. So Samyang, half the price cheaper. So we'll get started to the image quality and everything so you can see whether the Samyang holds for the price opposed to the Sony G Master. Now, just another side-by-side comparison, the 1.2 lens, that one is actually currently retailing about $2,899. So there is not much of a price difference between the 1.2 and the 1.4. But again, it is taller, a little bit taller, and it is heavy. It's about 700 something grams from memory. So if you want a bit more of a compact, wide aperture lens, 50mm, the 1.4 is actually pretty good. But that's just to give you a bit of a comparison with that. Hopefully I will do a side-by-side comparison between the 1.2 versus the 1.4. Now, eye autofocus. If you're looking at the side-by-side comparison between the Samyang versus the Sony GM lens, in terms of eye autofocus, setting the AF to continuous focus and then having it all on wide setting, showing the eyes, if you notice that both of them, they look in terms of par with the eye autofocus. So it keeps tracking with the eye, especially when my son keeps going out in frame, turning around, it always locks back in the eye. So I haven't noticed any difference in terms of the eye autofocus performance. Personally, I did find that they both performed equally well. If you're looking at this side-by-side comparison in image, these two are shot wide open. The left is the Samyang and the right is the Sony. They both were shot at 5500 Kelvin. So keeping the auto white balance the same. If you notice the Samyang color tones, it tends to favor a bit more of the warmer tones, where the Sony is more intended to be in the cooler tones. But if you're looking at the eye autofocus, personally, from looking at both images of my son's eye, they both look equally sharp. It is sort of kind of hard to tell. Sony might be a little tad sharper, but pixel peeping, it's hard to tell. But looking at it, Sony might be a little bit sharper, but they are very, very close. Looking at it at a distance, they look very identical. It's only when you pixel peep, you may notice that actually, they look very, very similar. It's sort of hard to tell. If you look around here, maybe, yeah, it's a little bit sharper on the Sony GM lens. So this is just a side-by-side comparison showing to you. But looking at it side-by-side at the normal rate, it is hard to tell that, which image is sharper, unless you sort of kind of pixel peep. But realistically, when you are showing clients your work, they're not going to sit there and pixel peep and say, oh, my eyelid or eyelash is soft, I don't like it. they're not going to do that. At the end of the day, they look for the image quality that you produce. Now, bokeh. Bokeh, in terms of both lenses, minimum focus distance for both of them is 40 centimeters. So they are very identical in terms of the minimum focus distance. If you're looking at this side-by-side comparison at my character Vegeta, Super Saiyan Blue, if you do watch Dragon Ball Z fans, looking at the side-by-side, left is Sony, right is Samyang. Now, the bokeh balls on the edges, Sony has more of the egg shape sort of bokeh on the edges. Center, it becomes a bit more in a nice perfectly circular bokeh. Samyang also has the egg shape in the edges as well as the center in that perfect circular bokeh. So their bokeh looks very identical, everything looks the same, to be honest. The shape, everything looks very identical in terms of the bokeh in both of them. Now, if we're doing a full body shot on both characters, having a bit more of a distance, again, it's hard to tell. The bokeh looks exactly the same, focusing both on the body of the character. But yeah, so you can see the bokeh, the background, they look very the same, identical. The shape is very similar, to be honest, from what I could tell. The size, everything in terms of the distance. So bokeh, for me, I think that they both are equally on par. If you're looking at side by side, from a distance, it's hard to sort of tell with the chromatic aberration. I think they both handle it very well. If you zoom in, Samyang does have, in certain parts of the image, depending how strong the highlights are, you do have a bit of an orange tinge of fringing on the leaves, whereas Sony, you do have the green fringing. So from distance, it's hard to tell unless you sort of kind of pixel peeping. But again, you are able to remove chromatic aberration from the lenses in post-processing if it becomes a hinder. Lens flare, they're both left being Sony, right being Samyang. To be honest, they both handle lens flare well. The star shape from the sun coming up behind the leaf actually looks really nice. It actually does handle lens flare, so you don't even see any of the lens flare coming through on the lenses. So that's a really good thing with the Sony lenses. Now, lens flare, a lot of people do like lens flare because they intend to add it in post, but having it naturally does add a bit of a characteristic to the image. But these two lenses, they both had lens hood on them as well, and they both handle the lens flare very well. Now, sharpness. Sharpness, doing a side-by-side comparison, so the left is Samyang, the right is Sony. I have the information here so that you guys can see and can easily follow through. So looking in the center at f1.4, the Sony looks a little bit sharper in the center, but it's not like a very big difference. It's sort of kind of hard to tell, but they do look slightly sharper than the Samyang in center. So comparing them side by side, the Samyang is sharp in the center, which is I really like, but the Sony, you can sort of see it's a little bit sharper in the center at 1.4. If you're looking at it wide open, the Samyang is softer in the corners comparing it to the Sony GM lens, wide open at 1.4 on the corners. f2.8, Samyang and Sony are both equally sharp in the center. For looking at the numbers in the 18-16, if you look here, Sony seems to have a bit more of a sharper edge on these little shapes compared to the Samyang. So Samyang still has is sharp, but if you're comparing it to Sony, Sony has that, still again has that edge of sharpness, but it does pick up a lot sharper at 2.8 in the center for the Samyang. Again, same thing, corner to corner sharpness for the Samyang. It is a bit softer than the Sony GM lens. Just to show you one more, f8, corner to corner sharpness. So Samyang starts to improve a lot more on their corner to corner sharpness, but again, Sony becomes a lot sharper on the corner. Center, both equally sharp in the center. Actually, the Samyang looks a tad sharper around here at f8 comparing it to the Sony. It could be just me, but it does look a little bit sharper, but side by side, you know, the corners, it has improved, but again, Sony is sharper corner to corner. Autofocus for video. Now, looking at this side-by-side comparison in terms of low light, autofocus for video, just showing the transition between the two. Now, if you notice, the Sony is a bit faster in the focus, but even though they're faster, I don't know why, but their quickness seems to be a bit more jerk. Now, in saying that, I do have my settings on my S3 set to fast in the transition because I want to test out how fast it is. Now, you can reduce the speed if you want to slow it down, but going to the fastest, the Sony is a bit fast. It is faster in terms of autofocus for video. You can see how it transitions. Samyang, it is slower, but I do like that smooth transition. Now, it's not very slow, like it's irritating slow. It is just a little bit slower, but has that nice smooth transition instead of that jerky speed in their autofocus. Now, if you're looking at in perfect lighting, I got my friend Joe coming back and forth in and out the frame. You can notice that the Sony is faster in focus, especially when she jumps in and out the frame, comparing it to the Samyang. Now, as a hobbyist, if you're doing a hobby videography work, things like that, you know, the 50mm Samyang, it is pretty good. If you want professional, I've always said, if you really want professional lenses in terms of autofocus, go for the Samyang VAF lenses. They're really quick in their autofocus and they're very precise and accurate. So I've always been promoting that. Currently, they've got the 24, 35 and 75 VAF lenses, and I've done reviews on them, so do check them out. I should have something popping up. But you know, if you're comparing it to the Sony GM lenses in terms of video autofocus, it is a bit quicker than the Samyang lens. Now, if you're comparing the Mark II version of the Samyang to the very first version of the 50mm, is a massive improvement compared to first autofocus Samyang lens of the 50mm. So that gives you a bit of a quick rundown on autofocus for video in both normal, good lighting, especially in low lighting. Autofocus for stills. In perfect lighting, as you can see in side-by-side comparison here, I'll have the description, which one's Sony, which one's Samyang, but they're very close in terms of autofocus in perfect lighting condition. Sony might be a little bit quicker than the Samyang if you look very carefully, but it is very hard to tell. So they do perform very well in extreme perfect lighting condition. Now, if you're looking at this side-by-side comparison in terms of low light, they are both equally on par. Again, they both perform really well in stills in both low light and daytime autofocus. So it is a lot quicker in both. The Sony might probably have a slight edge in terms of the autofocus, but it is, again, very hard to tell. Now, when I use it in the Samyang in my work environment, weddings, events, christenings, you name it, I've never had an issue with autofocus. It's always kept up very well, and those subjects aren't sitting still like these characters. They are actually moving. In conclusion, the video side of it, the Sony does perform better in terms of the autofocus for video, but stills, they both perform very equally well. So it just comes back to whether you want to save half the price and buy the Samyang, or if you want to pay the money and you get the G Master name. Now, again, people always say weight, size. Samyang is smaller and lighter than the Sony GM 1.4 lens. So at the end of the day, it just comes to you. So this is just more of a side-by-side comparison, giving you the chance to see in equal performance on how these two lenses can perform and the results they can achieve. So please leave your thoughts below in the comments on what lens you prefer and what lens you are planning to get. I hope this video helps. If it did, please give it a like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Until then, guys, we'll catch you later and have a good one. See ya.